The bustling streets of Los Angeles held countless stories, but none quite like this one. On a warm autumn evening in 2023, a black SUV pulled up outside a small coffee shop in downtown LA. Inside sat one of Hollywood's most recognized faces, Robert Chen, known to millions for his roles in blockbuster action movies and dramatic performances that had earned him both fame and fortune. But tonight, Robert wasn't thinking about his next big role or the upcoming award season. His mind was somewhere else, 25 years in the past, in a small neighborhood where he grew up. He had just finished scrolling through an article on his phone about the growing homeless crisis in the city when he spotted a familiar face in one of the photos, a face he hadn't seen in decades but could never forget. It was David Kumar, his childhood best friend. The same David who had taught him to ride a bike, who had shared his lunch with him when Robert's family couldn't afford much, who had believed in Robert's dreams of becoming an actor when everyone else laughed. The photo showed David sleeping on a bench, his face weathered by years of hardship, but Robert would recognize those kind eyes anywhere. The discovery shook Robert to his core. He remembered the last time he'd seen David, right before Robert left for college on a drama scholarship. They had promised to keep in touch, but life had gotten in the way. Robert's career had taken off quickly, and somewhere along the way, they had lost contact. The guilt of forgetting about his old friend weighed heavily on his heart. That night, Robert couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in his luxurious Malibu home, thinking about all the times David had been there for him. He remembered the day his father left, how David had shown up at his door with a basketball and stayed with him all day, not saying much but just being there. He thought about the school plays where David had helped him practice his lines for hours, never complaining once. The next morning, Robert canceled all his meetings and appointments. His agent wasn't happy, but for once, Robert didn't care about his professional obligations. He called in favors from friends who worked with homeless outreach programs in the city. He shared David's photo, asking if anyone had seen him recently. For 3 days, Robert drove through the streets of Los Angeles, visiting shelters and soup kitchens. He wasn't just looking for David, he was seeing his city through new eyes. He saw people who society had forgotten, each with their own story, their own past, their own dreams that had somehow slipped away. On the 4th day, while visiting a small community center near Echo Park, Robert finally got a lead. A volunteer recognized David from the photo. He sometimes came there for meals. The volunteer mentioned that David was different from many others she met. Despite his circumstances, he always tried to help around the center, often spending hours helping to clean up after meals or organizing donations. Robert's heart raced as he heard these details. It sounded exactly like the David he knew, always thinking of others, always trying to help, even when he had nothing to give but his time. The volunteer suggested Robert come back the next morning, as that's when David usually showed up for breakfast. That night, as Robert sat in his home office looking at old photographs from his childhood, he realized something profound. His success, which he had always attributed to his own hard work and talent, was built on the foundation of friendship and support from people like David. While he had been collecting accolades and building his career, he had somehow forgotten the most important parts of his past. He pulled out an old shoebox from his closet, filled with memories from his childhood. Inside, he found a folded piece of paper, a note David had written to him on his last day of high school. "You're going to make it big someday, Rob. Just don't forget about us little people when you do." The words, written in David's messy handwriting, brought tears to his eyes. As the sun set over the Pacific, Robert made a promise to himself. Whether he found David tomorrow or not, he would never again let success blind him to the things that truly mattered in life. He would use his platform and resources to make a difference, to help people who, like David, had fallen on hard times. The story of Robert and David was about to take a new turn, one that would remind everyone that true friendship knows no boundaries of time, success, or circumstance. And as Robert prepared for bed that night, he felt a mix of anxiety and hope about what the next day might bring. The next morning arrived with a mix of fog and sunshine typical of Los Angeles winters. Robert arrived at the community center an hour before breakfast service began. He had barely slept, spending most of the night remembering the countless moments he and David had shared in their youth. He chose to dress simply, jeans and a worn leather jacket, wanting to avoid drawing attention to himself. The center was already bustling with activity when he arrived. Volunteers moved about, setting up tables and preparing breakfast. Robert offered to help, and soon found himself pouring coffee into paper cups. It felt good to do something simple and meaningful, away from the cameras and spotlights that usually dominated his life. As people began filing in for breakfast, Robert's eyes scanned each face, his heart jumping every time someone remotely resembled David. The volunteer from yesterday, Mrs. Patel, touched his arm gently. "He usually comes in around 8, she said softly, understanding his anxiety. "He likes to wait until the initial rush is over. Always says others need the food more than him." While waiting, Robert chatted with some of the center's regulars. He heard stories that touched his heart, a former teacher who lost everything caring for her sick mother, a construction worker who couldn't work after an accident, a young woman who fled an abusive home. Each story reminded him how quickly life could change, how thin the line was between stability and struggle. At precisely 8:05 a.m., the center's door opened, and Robert's world seemed to stop. There stood David, older and weathered, but unmistakably the same person who had been his closest friend all those years ago. He wore layers of clothes, all worn but clean, and carried a small backpack that had seen better days. His hair had gone gray at the temples, but his walk, that slight bounce in his step, remained unchanged. For a moment, Robert couldn't move. He watched as David politely greeted the volunteers, asking Mrs. Patel about her grandson's school play. Even in his circumstances, he still cared about others' lives, still maintained that warmth that had made him such a wonderful friend in their youth. David hadn't noticed Robert yet, focused on helping an elderly man find a seat with his breakfast tray. Robert took a deep breath and walked over, his heart pounding so hard he thought everyone must hear it. He stopped a few feet away, and with a slightly shaky voice said, "Hey, DJ. Still helping everyone else before yourself, I see." DJ, it was Robert's old nickname for David, from their days of pretending to be radio hosts in David's garage. Only Robert had ever called him that. David froze, then slowly turned around. Their eyes met, and for a long moment, neither spoke. The years seemed to fall away, and they were just two kids from the old neighborhood again. David's eyes widened with recognition, then filled with a mix of emotions, surprise, joy, and something else, perhaps embarrassment. "Rob," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is it really you?" Robert nodded, fighting back tears. "It's me, DJ. It's been way too long." What happened next surprised everyone in the center. David didn't rush forward for a hug. Instead, he took a step back, his face showing a complex mix of emotions. "You made it," he said, managing a small smile. "I always knew you would." Then, glancing down at his worn clothes, he added, "Though I didn't expect our reunion to be quite like this." The dignity in David's response, his refusal to simply accept pity, reminded Robert exactly why they had been such close friends. David had always been the stronger one, the one with true character. Robert took a careful step forward. "I saw your picture in an article," he explained. "I've been looking for you for days." David's expression softened slightly. "You didn't have to do that, Rob. You've got your own life now. I've seen you in the movies, you're doing great things." "None of that matters right now," Robert replied, his voice cracking slightly. "What matters is that I forgot what was important. I forgot the person who believed in me when nobody else did. And I need to make that right." The other people in the center had fallen silent, watching this reunion unfold. Mrs. Patel quietly began directing others to give them space, understanding the significance of what was happening. David looked around, suddenly aware of the attention. "Maybe we should talk somewhere else," he suggested. Robert nodded, grateful for the suggestion. "There's a small park around the corner. We could walk there, if you want. Just like old times, when we used to walk to school together." David hesitated for a moment, then nodded. As they walked toward the door, David turned to Mrs. Patel. "I'll be back to help clean up after breakfast," he promised. She smiled and shook her head. "Take your time, dear. Some things are more important than dishes." As they stepped out into the morning sunshine, both men felt the weight of 25 years of unspoken words between them. They had so much to say, so much to explain, so much to understand. But for now, they just walked in silence, two old friends finding their way back to each other, one step at a time. The small park was quiet at this hour, with only a few morning joggers passing through. Robert and David found a bench near a flowering jacaranda tree, its purple blossoms occasionally drifting down in the gentle breeze. For a while, they just sat there, the morning sun warming their faces, each trying to find the right words to bridge the gap of 25 years. David was the first to break the silence. "I watched all your movies, you know," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. "Even that terrible one about the talking dolphin." He chuckled softly, and for a moment, Robert heard the echo of their teenage laughter. "Oh God, not Dolphin Dreams," Robert groaned, but he was smiling. "That was before I fired my first agent." "But you actually watched it?" "Front row at the Dollar Theater," David nodded. "I was probably the only person who saw it twice. The second time was just to make sure it was really as bad as I remembered." His eyes twinkled with the same mischievous light that Robert remembered from their youth. The easy banter helped break the tension, but both men knew they needed to address the harder questions. Robert turned to face his old friend. "What happened, DJ? Last I heard, you were starting your own business, doing computer repair work." David's face grew serious, and he looked down at his worn hands. "Life happened, I guess. The business was doing well for a while. I had a small shop, 3 employees, even started offering coding classes for kids." He paused, taking a deep breath. "Then my mom got sick. Cancer. You remember how it was just the two of us after Dad left?" Robert nodded. David's mother had been like a second mom to him, always having an extra plate at dinner when things were tough at Robert's house. "The insurance wouldn't cover most of the treatments," David continued. "I sold everything, the shop, my car, my apartment. Moved back in with her to take care of her. She fought hard for 2 years, but..." His voice trailed off, and Robert instinctively placed a hand on his shoulder, just as David had done for him countless times in their youth. "Why didn't you try to contact me?" Robert asked softly. "I would have helped." David gave him a gentle smile. "You were just starting to make it big then. Your first serious drama role had just come out. I saw the interviews where you talked about growing up poor, about finally being able to help your family. I couldn't bring myself to add to that burden." Robert felt tears welling up in his eyes. Even now, after everything, David was still thinking of others first. "You were never a burden, DJ. You were family." "Maybe," David acknowledged. "But sometimes pride is all you have left. After Mom passed, I tried to rebuild, but the medical debts were overwhelming. The economy crashed, and tech support became something people could get overseas for a fraction of the cost. I picked up odd jobs, lived in cheaper and cheaper places, until eventually..." He gestured vaguely at himself. "But you stayed in LA," Robert observed. "All this time, we were in the same city." David's eyes took on a distant look. "I guess I did. Funny thing is, I always hoped I'd run into you someday." Not like this, though. He laughed softly. I had this whole scenario planned out. I was going to be successful too, maybe running a big tech company. We'd bump into each other at some fancy restaurant, and I'd say something cool like, "Took you long enough to find me." Robert couldn't help but smile. That does sound more like your style. You were always the one with the big plans. Remember when you convinced me to run for student body president? And you won. David's face lit up at the memory. That speech you gave was amazing. That's when I knew you'd make it as an actor. You had the whole school believing you could change the cafeteria menu and get us longer lunch breaks. I only won because you stayed up all night making those campaign posters, Robert reminded him. And then you actually went and organized that petition that did get us longer lunch breaks. They shared a laugh, and for a moment, the years between them seemed to dissolve. But reality soon crept back in as a cool breeze made David pull his worn jacket tighter around himself. Robert watched this small gesture, and something inside him broke. "Come stay with me," he said suddenly. "I have a guest house that's just sitting empty. You can have all the time and space you need to get back on your feet." David's expression changed, a flash of that old pride showing through. "Rob, I appreciate it, but I can't just." "You can," Robert interrupted firmly. "And you will. Because that's what family does. And because I'm not losing you again." He paused, then added softly, "Please, DJ. Let me help you the way you always helped me." David sat quietly for a long moment, watching the jacaranda blossoms fall. Finally, he turned to Robert with tears in his eyes. "Only if you let me help around the house. And I want to volunteer at the center still. Those people there, they're my family too now." Robert felt his heart swell with pride and love for his friend. Even now, David was setting terms, maintaining his dignity, thinking of others. "Deal," he said, extending his hand like they used to do when making playground promises. David took his hand, and they shook on it, both understanding that this was more than just an agreement about housing. It was a promise to rebuild their friendship, to make up for lost time, to be there for each other again. The drive to Robert's Malibu home was filled with a comfortable mix of conversation and contemplative silence. David sat in the passenger seat of Robert's SUV, his small backpack, containing everything he owned, clutched tightly in his lap. As they drove along the Pacific Coast Highway, the ocean stretching endlessly to their right, Robert couldn't help but notice how David's eyes widened at each turn, revealing another stunning view. "You know," David said, breaking a moment of silence, "I used to come out to the beach sometimes, early in the morning when I could catch the bus. Just to watch the sunrise and remember our senior year spring break." He smiled at the memory. "Remember how we saved up for months to rent that beat-up van and drove down to San Diego?" Robert laughed, remembering. "That van broke down 3 times. And we had to pool our last $20 for gas to get home. But we made it," David said softly, his words carrying a weight beyond that long-ago road trip. As they pulled up to Robert's house, David went quiet. The modern mansion, with its glass walls and ocean views, stood as a stark reminder of how different their lives had become. Robert parked the car and led David not to the main house, but along a stone path that wound through a carefully maintained garden. "The guest house is actually my favorite part of the property," Robert explained as they walked. "It's more like the kind of place I always imagined living in when we were kids." The guest house, while still luxurious by most standards, had a cozier feel, warm wood exterior, a small porch with comfortable chairs, and large windows that let in plenty of natural light. Inside, the space was warm and inviting, with a fully furnished living room, kitchen, bedroom, and bathroom. David stood in the entrance, taking it all in, his hands trembling slightly. "This is too much, Rob," he whispered. Robert shook his head. "It's not enough, DJ. Not after everything." He walked to the kitchen and opened the fridge, which he had asked his housekeeper to stock that morning. "There's food, clean clothes in the bedroom, and the bathroom has everything you might need. Take your time, get settled in. I'll be in the main house when you're ready." Before leaving, Robert placed a new iPhone on the kitchen counter. "My number's already in there. Use it anytime, day or night. I mean it." He squeezed David's shoulder gently, then left him to process everything in private. Back in the main house, Robert called his manager to clear his schedule for the next few weeks. There was pushback about an upcoming publicity tour for his latest film, but Robert stood firm. "Family emergency," he said simply. "Everything else can wait." Hours passed, and Robert resisted the urge to check on David, knowing his friend needed space to adjust. As the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the beach below, his phone buzzed with a text, "Thank you for everything. But I'm still a better cook than you. Come over for dinner?" Robert smiled, remembering how David used to cook for both of them during high school, creating meals out of whatever limited ingredients they had. When he arrived at the guest house, he found David in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, hair still damp from a shower, cooking what smelled like his famous stir-fry. "I found ginger and soy sauce in the pantry," David explained, looking more like his old self. "Remember how we used to add extra ginger because we thought it made us sound sophisticated when we complained that the school cafeteria food wasn't properly spiced?" They fell into an easy rhythm, with Robert setting the table while David cooked, just like they used to do at David's house after school. The food was simple but delicious, and as they ate, they continued sharing memories, each story bringing them closer to bridging the years that had separated them. After dinner, they sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge over the ocean. David seemed lost in thought, and Robert waited patiently, knowing his friend would speak when ready. "I want to help others," David finally said. "People like me, who just need a chance to get back on their feet. The community center does good work, but they're always struggling for resources." He turned to Robert. "I know computers, I know what it's like to be out there. Maybe there's a way to make a difference." Robert felt a familiar excitement building, the same feeling he used to get when David would come up with one of his big ideas in high school. "Tell me more," he said, leaning forward in his chair. As David began outlining his vision for a program that would combine technology education with practical support for homeless individuals, Robert watched his friend come alive. The passion, the intelligence, the desire to help others, none of that had been lost during his years on the streets. It had just been waiting for a chance to shine again. That night, after returning to the main house, Robert stood at his window, looking out at the lights of the guest house. He thought about how easily things could have gone differently for either of them. Success, he realized, wasn't just about talent or hard work, it was also about having people who believed in you, supported you, gave you chances when you needed them. Over the next few weeks, a remarkable transformation began to unfold. David, with his natural technical abilities still sharp, spent mornings at the community center teaching basic computer skills to others experiencing homelessness. The classes started small, just 3 or 4 people gathered around a donated laptop, but word spread quickly about the patient teacher who understood their struggles firsthand. Robert found himself drawn to the center more often, quietly observing from the background. He watched as David helped an elderly woman set up her first email account so she could communicate with her grandchildren. He saw how David stayed late to help a young man prepare for a job interview, teaching him how to create a professional-looking resume. One morning, Robert arrived to find David deep in conversation with Mrs. Patel about the center's outdated computer system. "The old desktop keeps crashing," David explained later. "They're losing valuable time that could be spent helping people." His eyes had that familiar gleam that Robert remembered from their youth, the look that always preceded one of his innovative ideas. That evening, over another of David's home-cooked meals in the guest house, they started planning. Robert had the resources, and David had the vision and experience. Together, they began developing a proposal for a comprehensive technology training program at the center. It would include not just basic computer skills, but also coding, digital literacy, and job preparation. The thing is, David explained, gesturing with his fork, it's not just about teaching people to use computers. It's about giving them back their dignity, their connection to the world. When you're out there, you feel invisible. Technology can be a bridge back to society. Robert noticed how David said, "You're out there," instead of, "When I was out there," a subtle reminder that his friends still identified deeply with those he was helping. It made the program they were planning feel even more meaningful. As they worked on the proposal, their old dynamic naturally re-emerged. David was the idea person, thinking through every detail and potential challenge, while Robert used his connections and experience to make things happen. It was just like their high school days, but now instead of planning school events, they were creating something that could change lives. The transformation wasn't just in their work. David began to stand straighter, to smile more easily. He started wearing the new clothes Robert had bought him, though he insisted on keeping some of his old ones, to remember. He still kept his promises to help at the center, but now he was doing more than just cleaning, he was becoming a leader, a mentor, someone others looked up to. Robert, too, was changing. His publicist had been pushing him to do interviews about finding his old friend, seeing it as a perfect human interest story. But Robert refused. Some things are too important for publicity, he said firmly. Instead, he began using his influence more quietly, making calls to tech companies about equipment donations, reaching out to former co-stars about funding for the center. One particularly meaningful moment came when David received his first payment for teaching at the center, a modest sum that Robert had arranged through a local education grant. David stared at the check for a long time, his hands trembling slightly. "You okay?" Robert asked softly. David nodded, tears in his eyes. "It's not about the money," he said. "It's about feeling useful again. Like I have something to offer." He looked up at Robert. "You know what the best part is? When I'm teaching, nobody cares that I was homeless. They just care that I know what I'm talking about and that I understand what they're going through." Robert watched as David carefully folded the check and put it in his wallet. It was a small moment, but it represented something huge, the beginning of David reclaiming his independence, his sense of self-worth. That night, they sat on the beach behind Robert's house, something that had become their evening ritual. The sound of waves provided a peaceful backdrop as they discussed the day's events and planned for tomorrow. David had been teaching himself new coding languages in his free time, preparing to expand his classes. "I never lost hope," David said suddenly, his voice barely audible over the waves. "Even on the coldest nights, when I had nothing, I kept believing things would get better. I just never expected better to look like this." He gestured at the ocean, the house, but his eyes were fixed on Robert. Robert felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You were always the hopeful one," he said. "Remember in junior year, when I wanted to quit drama club after that disaster of a performance? You told me that failure was just a setup for a better comeback story." David laughed. "Well, I was right, wasn't I? Look at you now, except for dolphin dreams, of course." They both laughed, the sound carrying across the empty beach. As their laughter faded, David grew serious again. "I want you to know something, Rob. Yes, you've given me a place to stay and helped me get back on my feet. But the most important thing you've given me is the chance to help others. That's worth more than any roof or meal." As spring bloomed in Los Angeles, the small computer training program at the community center had grown into something neither David nor Robert had initially imagined. What started as basic computer literacy classes had evolved into a full-fledged technology education center, with courses ranging from basic email setup to advanced coding workshops. The transformation of the center's back room into a modern computer lab had been a labor of love. Robert had provided the initial funding, but it was David's practical experience that made it work. He knew exactly what equipment would be most useful, how to set up the space to be welcoming rather than intimidating, and most importantly, how to make everyone who walked through the door feel valued. One morning, as David was setting up for his first class of the day, a young woman arrived early. She had been coming to the classes for several weeks, walking 2 hours each way because she couldn't afford bus fare. David had noticed her dedication, staying late after class to practice what she'd learned. "I got a job," she announced, her voice trembling with excitement. "That resume we worked on, the email etiquette you taught us, it all helped. It's just a reception position at a dental office, but they're going to train me on their scheduling software." She paused, wiping tears from her eyes. "I can finally get my kids back from my sister's place." David hugged her, remembering his own journey. Later that day, when he shared the news with Robert, both men felt the profound impact of their work. It wasn't just about teaching computer skills, it was about restoring hope, rebuilding lives, creating opportunities. The success stories began to multiply. A former truck driver learned enough coding to become a junior web developer. An elderly man who'd lost his savings to a scam now taught other seniors about internet safety. Each success strengthened David's resolve to do more. Robert watched his friend flourish in his new role. The passion that had always been there was now focused on creating lasting change. David's experience on the streets gave him a unique perspective that made his teaching especially effective. He knew when someone needed extra encouragement, when they were close to giving up, when they needed practical help beyond just technical training. One evening, as they were closing up the center, Mrs. Patel brought them both cups of her special chai tea. "You know," she said, stirring her cup thoughtfully, "when you first started this program, I worried it might be just another well-meaning but temporary project. We've seen those before." She smiled warmly at David. "But you understood what people really needed, not just knowledge, but respect. Understanding. Community." David nodded, understanding completely. "When I was out there, the hardest part wasn't always the physical discomfort. It was feeling disconnected, like the world was moving forward without you. Technology can be intimidating when you're already feeling left behind, but it can also be the key to reconnecting." Robert, who had been quietly sipping his tea, spoke up. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "The success we're having here, it shouldn't be limited to just one center." He looked at David. "What if we could create a model that could be replicated in other communities? Your curriculum, your approach to teaching, the way you combine technical training with personal support, it works. It really works." David's eyes lit up with the possibility, but then he hesitated. That would take considerable resources, Rob. And more importantly, it would need people who understand both the technical side and the human side. "Which is exactly why you should lead it," Robert said firmly. "You've lived both sides of this story. You know what works because you've been there. And now you've proven what's possible." They stayed late into the evening, brainstorming ideas for expansion. David pulled out his laptop, the same one Robert had given him months ago, and began outlining a plan. He thought about all the people he'd met on the streets, their untapped potential, their desperate need for a chance to prove their worth. "We'll need to train more instructors," David mused, typing quickly. "People who've been through the program themselves would be ideal. They'll understand the challenges, the fears, the hopes." He looked up at Robert. "And we'll need to ensure it stays personal, even as it grows. No one should feel like just another number in the system." Robert watched his friend work, marveling at how life had come full circle. Years ago, they had sat in David's bedroom, dreaming up big plans to change the world. Now, older and perhaps wiser, they were finally in a position to make those dreams reality. As they finally prepared to leave for the night, a gentle rain had begun to fall over Los Angeles. David paused in the doorway of the center, looking back at the room that had become so much more than just a computer lab. It was a place of transformation, of second chances, of renewed hope. "You know what's funny?" he said to Robert as they walked to the car. "When you first found me, I thought you were trying to save me. But the truth is, this work, these people, they saved me just as much as you did. They gave me purpose again." Robert smiled, remembering all the times David had helped him find his own purpose when they were young. "Maybe that's how it always works," he replied. "We save each other, one small act of kindness at a time." 6 months after their reunion, the changes in both men's lives had become profound. The guest house, though still David's home base, had slowly transformed into a kind of unofficial office, with whiteboards covered in plans and a small conference area where they held meetings with potential partners and supporters. Robert had just returned from a film shoot in New York, having negotiated his schedule to allow him to be in Los Angeles every other week to help with the program. He found David in the guest house, surrounded by paperwork and looking more professional than ever in a simple blue button-down shirt, yet still wearing his favorite worn sneakers, a small reminder of where he'd been. "The foundation paperwork came through," David announced as soon as Robert walked in. "We're officially a non-profit organization." His eyes sparkled with excitement as he held up the documents. "The New Start Tech initiative is real." Robert grinned, remembering their late-night discussions about what to name their organization. David had insisted on something simple and direct, just like the program itself. "How are the new locations coming along?" he asked, settling into his usual chair. "The San Diego Center opens next month," David replied, pulling up a presentation on his laptop. "And we've got 3 more cities interested. But here's the really exciting part, remember Lee from our advanced coding class?" Robert nodded. Lee had been one of their first students, a former accountant who'd lost everything during the pandemic. "He's going to run the San Diego program," David continued. "He's already got ideas for partnering with local businesses for internship opportunities. And remember that app he developed in class? The one to help people locate nearby resources? We're implementing it across all our locations." The app had been Lee's final project in their coding program, a simple but effective tool that helped people find everything from food banks to job training centers. It was exactly the kind of practical innovation that their program encouraged. "But that's not even the best news," David said, his voice growing softer. "Remember Maria, the young mom who got the reception job? She just enrolled in community college. Night classes in computer science. She stops by the center between work and school, helps tutor the beginners. Her kids are back with her, and her oldest is teaching the younger ones how to use computers." Robert watched as David shared these success stories, noting how his friend's face lit up with each one. The homeless man he'd found at the community center months ago had been replaced by someone who looked more like the David he remembered from their youth, confident, purposeful, alive with possibilities. But it wasn't just David who had changed. Robert found himself viewing his own success differently now. His latest film had been a huge hit, and instead of celebrating with the usual industry parties, he'd used the premiere to raise awareness and funds for their initiative. His acceptance speech at a recent award ceremony had focused not on himself but on the importance of second chances and the untapped potential in every community. "You know what still amazes me?" David said, closing his laptop. "How many people out there are just like I was, not looking for handouts, just needing a chance to rebuild. Every person who comes through our program has a story, has something to offer. They just need someone to see it." Robert nodded, thinking about how close they had come to losing touch forever. "Speaking of seeing potential," he said, "your interview with the Tech Education Journal comes out next week. Are you ready for it?" David laughed nervously. "Still feels strange, being on that side of success. But if it helps get our message out there." He paused, looking thoughtful. "You know, the journalist asked me what made our program different from other job training initiatives. I told her it was. Because we don't just teach skills, we rebuild confidence. We give people back their story. They were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Patel, who had become their unofficial advisor and strongest supporter. She came bearing her signature chai and news about a potential partnership with a major tech company. As they sat discussing the details, Robert watched David confidently leading the conversation, outlining their vision and requirements. He remembered their conversation on that first morning at the community center, how David had been reluctant to accept help. Now here he was, helping to create a network of support that would reach thousands. Later that evening, they took their usual walk on the beach. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. A cool breeze carried the salt spray, and seagulls wheeled overhead, their calls mixing with the sound of the waves. Sometimes I wake up thinking this has all been a dream, David admitted, watching the waves roll in. Not just the program's success, but this whole second chance at life. Then I remember all the people we're helping, and it feels more real than anything. Robert understood completely. You know what one of my acting teachers used to say? The best stories aren't about the destination, they're about the journey and the lives you touch along the way. David smiled. Sounds like something I would have said back in high school, when I was full of big ideas and bigger dreams. You still are, Robert replied. The only difference is now we have the means to make those dreams reality. 1 year to the day after their reunion at the community center, Robert and David stood together on a stage in downtown Los Angeles. The occasion was the grand opening of their 5th New Start Tech Center, but it was more than just another ribbon-cutting ceremony. This center was special. It was located just blocks from their old neighborhood, in the same community where their friendship had first begun. The building, a renovated warehouse, had been transformed into a state-of-the-art training facility. But unlike typical tech spaces with their sleek, intimidating atmospheres, this one felt welcoming and warm. The walls featured inspiring success stories and photographs of graduates, and comfortable seating areas encouraged people to gather and support each other. As David prepared to address the crowd, he caught sight of familiar faces in the audience. There was Lee, who now ran their San Diego location, sitting next to Maria and her children. Mrs. Patel was there with her grandson, who had recently started volunteering at the original center. Even some of David's old friends from his time on the streets had come, now enrolled in various stages of the program. When I look around this room, David began, his voice steady and clear, I see more than just computers and classrooms. I see second chances. I see hope. I see family. He paused, looking at Robert. A year ago, I was living on the streets, convinced that my story was over. Then an old friend found me and reminded me that every story has multiple chapters. Robert watched from the side of the stage, remembering that morning when he'd first spotted David's photo in the newspaper. He thought about how close they'd come to missing this chapter entirely, how many small decisions and moments had led to this day. But this isn't just my story, David continued. It's the story of every person who's ever felt forgotten or left behind. It's about Lee, who went from sleeping in his car to running our San Diego center. It's about Maria, who's now helping other single parents navigate their way back to stability. It's about everyone who's ever needed someone to believe in them. As David spoke, Robert noticed a group of current students in the audience, many of whom he recognized from their visits to the centers. They were nodding along, some wiping away tears, others smiling with determination. They understood, better than most, the journey David was describing. Technology isn't just about computers and coding, David explained, his passion evident in every word. It's about connection. It's about being part of the modern world. It's about having the tools to tell your own story. He gestured to the building around them. This center, like all our centers, isn't just a school, it's a community. A place where people can rebuild their lives one keystroke at a time. After the ceremony, as people mingled and explored the new facility, Robert found David in their old neighborhood's dinner spot, now a small cafe that would be providing job training opportunities for their program participants. They sat at a corner table, both feeling the weight of the moment. "Remember when we used to come here after school?" David asked, looking around the renovated space. "We'd split a plate of fries and talk about how we were going to change the world someday." Robert smiled, remembering those afternoons clearly. "We had no idea how to do it back then. But maybe we needed to take different paths to figure it out. Maybe we needed all those years apart to appreciate what we could do together." David nodded, understanding. "You know what the best part is? Every success story from our centers creates a ripple effect. Each person who rebuilds their life goes on to help others do the same. It's like we've created this endless chain of people lifting each other up." Looking out the cafe window, they could see people still streaming into the new center. Each person entering represented a new possibility, a new story waiting to be written. The center stood as a beacon of hope in the community, much like their friendship had been a beacon for each other all those years ago. "I never got to properly thank you," David said suddenly, turning back to Robert. "Not just for finding me that day, but for seeing me, really seeing me, even when I was at my lowest." Robert shook his head. "You don't need to thank me, DJ. You're the one who showed me what real success looks like. It's not about awards or acclaim. It's about making a difference in people's lives, just like you always did for me when we were kids." As the sun began to set outside, casting long shadows through the cafe windows, both men sat in comfortable silence, watching their dream take shape in the steady stream of people entering the center. They had come full circle, from two kids sharing dreams over French fries to two men making those dreams reality. "So," Robert said finally, a familiar twinkle in his eye, "what's next? We've got 5 centers now. Why not 50? David laughed, the same laugh that had lifted Robert's spirits countless times in their youth. "One step at a time," he said, but his eyes were already bright with possibilities. "Though I do have some ideas about expanding our program to include youth mentorship." And just like that, they were off again, planning and dreaming, two old friends continuing their journey together. Their story had become more than just a tale of reunion, it was a testament to the power of friendship, second chances, and the ripple effect of kindness. In finding each other again, they had found a way to help others find themselves, creating a legacy that would continue to grow, one life at a time.